Welcome everyone to CCI Huronia's first Lunch and Learn webinar. I hope you all have a great lunch with you and a preferred beverage of choice because we're going to have an exciting hour and a half, and it's always good to have something to keep us energized and keep us going. My name is Sonia Hodis. I'm one of the many directors at CCI Huronia and a condo lawyer, as well as your moderator today. Our webinar today has been generously sponsored by Aliyah Associates Professional Corporation, Condo Ginny, and CWB Maxim Financial. You saw those logos as you came into the webinar from the waiting room, and we'd like to thank those sponsors for their generous support and for allowing CCI Huronia to be able to offer this webinar free of charge today. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Today we have with us several speakers on our panel. We have Patricia Aliyah, who is a condo lawyer from Aliyah Associates. We have Carla Guthrie, who's a property manager and CEO of MF Property Management. We have Caroline Graham, who's a property manager and district manager at Dell Property Management. And we have Jeff Struwing, who is a property manager and vice president of operations at Shorter Slope Management Services and also vice president of CCI Huronia. So thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things. In respect to reminders, please shut off your video if you are not speaking and mute your phone or mute your mic if you're online. Again, we would like to get the best possible recording of this webinar that we can, so it does help us if everyone who is not speaking shuts off their video and their audio. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our website, hopefully within the next couple of days. If you're having any trouble during the webinar with the connection, the best thing to do is end the meeting and then log back in again. And as a last resort, if that still isn't working, you can always log in by phone. If you go back to your confirmation, you'll find in all the login details there. We will be taking live questions for our speakers at the end of the webinar. You can continue to put questions in the chat box if you would like, and we'll try and answer them during the webinar as well. However, if you would like to ask a question at the end and ask a live question, there's a couple ways you can do it. If you are on the phone, you just need to dial *9, and that will indicate to me that you would like to ask a question, and I'll unmute you at that time. If you are logged in, then all you need to do is click on the participant tab. That's the two heads that you see at the bottom of your screen if you scroll over it, and then press the raise hand function. And again, that will just alert me that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll unmute you when it's time. If you no longer want to ask a question, just lower your hand. And then in terms of our standard disclaimer, this is just a reminder that this webinar is general advice, general information, not specific advice about your specific fact situation. And so the information that you get today is not intended to provide you with an opinion that would protect you under Section 37 of the Condominium Act if you're a condominium director. And as such, if you want to avail yourself of that protection, you do need to get a professional opinion from your professional advisors. Also, please be aware that this webinar, information in this webinar is current as of June 10th. 2020, and any references to legislation are references to Ontario legislation. So the purpose of today's webinar is to address some of the pros and cons of implementing this type of bylaw that we're going to be talking about, which is an electronic voting and an electronic meeting bylaw, and also take a look at what considerations need to be taken into account when drafting the bylaw. We are not going to get into a discussion today about how you actually hold a virtual meeting or how you do electronic voting. We are really just going to start right at the basics and go back to the basics, starting with the bylaw itself, which is required to be able to do this if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic. So let's just go back in history a little bit. If we go back to April 24th, the Ontario government passed an order in council that allowed for electronic voting and meetings without a bylaw during the emergency period. And in May, on May 12th, Bill 190 was passed that clarified that the emergency period in which the bylaw would not be required was extended for 120 days after the declared state of emergency ended. So right now, that has been extended to June 30th. So we basically have until about the end of October right now to be able to hold virtual meetings and electronic voting without a bylaw. However, this is not going to be like this forever, and we need to be proactive and look at whether or not we want to get these bylaws passed so that we're ready for the time when it comes that the state of emergency is no longer in place and we're beyond the 120 days. So what does that look like? So let's imagine state of emergency is over, we're beyond the 120 days, we want to have this bylaw in place. What does it look like? So in terms of our legislation, we have the Condominium Act and the Regulation 4801 under that act. And both those pieces of legislation permit electronic voting and virtual meetings if a Conocorp has a bylaw. So if we go to Section 56, which is our general bylaw provision, Section 56(1)Q says that you can have bylaws on any other prescribed purpose, and that's code for check the regulations. If you then go to the regulations, Section 14, sub 0.1 sub P says bylaws can address matters in which owners and mortgagees can be present at a meeting of owners or represented by proxy. So this is what allows the virtual meeting to take place. In addition, Section 12.81D says that the notice of meeting must state the manner in which an owner may be present at a meeting and vote in accordance with Section 52. So if you are sending out your notices of meeting, you need to make sure you state how the meeting is going to be held. And then Section 52(1) sub B sub 3 of the Condo Act allows for electronic voting. And specifically it says that you can vote by telephonic or electronic means. And that's defined as any means that uses the telephone or any other electronic or other technological means to transmit information or data, including telephone calls, fax, email, automated touch-tone telephone systems, computer or computer networks. So that's basically the legislative bones in terms of how we are allowed to do this by bylaw. And then when it comes to passing the bylaw, the process is really the same as we would for any bylaw. There's 4 steps. It has to be drafted, it has to be approved by the board, then it has to be approved by the owners, and then it has to be registered. The big difference is that a typical bylaw requires the majority of units to vote in favor. That's Section 5610. But Regulation 4801 has a provision, Section 14 sub 2, that says when it comes to an electronic meeting and voting bylaws, you only need a majority of units represented at the meeting. So this is a much lower threshold than the standard bylaw requirement. So for example, if you have 100 units in a condo, 50 are in attendance at the meeting, you have quorum. So typical bylaw, you need 51 or more units to vote in favor. The electronic meeting and voting bylaw, you only need more than 25 to vote in favor. So as you can see, that is a big distinction in terms of the requirement for the number of people. So now that we know sort of the legislative framework and how to pass the bylaw, let's hear from our property managers on the pros and cons of electronic voting. And we're going to focus on electronic voting first, and then we're going to talk about electronic meeting bylaws second. And although you can put both of these in the same bylaw, they are 2 distinct things. So we're going to talk about electronic voting first. And our first speaker is Carla Guthrie. And Carla, I'm just going to unmute you. Carla, I'm trying to unmute you.
Hi there.
Hi, Carla. Great. Great that you're on. So one of the things that we've been hearing from property managers and from directors in terms of resisting doing electronic voting is people are afraid of the technology. So can you give us some insights in terms of pros and cons with respect to an electronic voting bylaw and how we deal with this fear of technology?
Well, the challenges to the technology are, they have to do with access and comfort level, I suppose. And I have a perfect example today because I couldn't get my video working because of the poor internet connection. So really, there's a trepidation of using it, and I guess it's understandable because it's new and it's different from how we've always used it. I think the fear, it's owners, boards, and managers as well. with managers. They may be very comfortable with computers, but when you're responsible for organizing it, you want to understand how it works and be able to problem solve if something goes wrong. And as far as owners are concerned, there's such a wide range of comfort with technology, and also access to technology is probably a bigger challenge with that. Now, I think the bylaw provides you with an option, so it doesn't mean if you pass the bylaw, it doesn't mean that you have to use it in every single situation each and every year, but there are some advantages that I think boards and managers should consider when making the decision. You have to know your condo, and you have to determine if it's an option for you. As far as the technology is concerned, it's probably relatively new, but everything will always, I see as with technology, it'll keep improving. It'll always become more user-friendly. I know today there's a couple of service providers that offer platforms for electronic voting, and I would probably suggest that if you're going to use it, ask questions. They offer demos, and so you understand how it's going to work. And then I think a big thing is to communicate with your owners, give them an idea of what to expect. If you provide the information and have a little patience, I think that'll go a long way to making it work. And I think another thing to consider is that by allowing electronic voting, you are improving access, or maybe even being more inclusive with a certain set of groups. So right now, aside from using proxies, you have to come physically to the meeting. And if you had electronic voting, you can actually include owners who can't physically attend but participate, such as maybe snowbirds, off-site owners, or even owners who can't attend due to health concerns. So I think there's advantages. I think there's resistance at first, and just acknowledge that the first time is going to be the hardest time, and it will get easier to use. And the access to computers is a challenge for some buildings, for demographics with certain owners. Maybe don't assume. I think we've had a lot of access with community websites. Every year, more and more people are coming online, and maybe remember that access might be a challenge today, but it might not always be the case. So I would just say, be prepared to revisit the situation, know what is going on in your building, and then you can make a decision on whether it's right for you, and be open to revisiting it in the future.
Thanks, Carla. And as Dr. Sin said yesterday on our webinar, just breathe when you're dealing with anxiety. So just the same thing with technology and anxiety with technology, just breathe and you'll get through it. All right, so Jeff, I want you to talk to us about the concerns that people are having with respect to the election of directors and potential directors or candidates being able to communicate with owners. And so when it comes to the electronic voting bylaw and electronic voting, what are the pros and cons and some solutions?
Sure. So some of the cons and concerns, I guess, would be anyone who's interested in putting their name forward for election may not have opportunity to take the podium and tell all the owners about themselves. We've seen a lot more advance intentions of board members since the amendments to the Condominium Act. So with pre-notice going out and requesting candidates advise their intention, we've started asking them to provide resumes and so on that we can include with the meeting package. So I think that can be overcome as long as there's enough advance notice and encouragement for homeowners to put their name forward. There are certainly less volunteers for board positions since the amendments to the act. So I think that's important to get messaging out early. We normally will include something with the budget layer, so they're getting something, almost 6 months in advance, and in a lot of cases as well. So they have time to think if they want to put their name forward and maybe put together a resume, and that can be circulated then in advance of the actual meeting. There's always, the chance that somebody's going to be at the meeting, see what's going on, and then decide that, hey, maybe they should put their name forward for election. They're typically at a disadvantage because those who provided their intention ahead of time and made it onto the proxy have garnered votes ahead of the meeting. So depending on how many are in attendance at the meeting versus the proxies, they could be at a strong disadvantage, but it is still possible. They could use raise hand in a Zoom platform or the chat box, depending on what the preferred method of making their intention known. The microphone, I suppose, could be handed over to each of the candidates, including from the floor, to give a time-limited, quick summary about their experiences and why they should be on the board. So, as many challenges as there are, most of them are probably technology related, and as Carla said, different demographics will have different comfort levels with the technology and taking a microphone at a virtual meeting and talking about themselves or providing a written resume in advance. But with some encouragement from past directors or current directors or management, some of those fears, I think, can be alleviated. And as the technology becomes more and more popular, I think it's going to be around to stay for quite some time. I think it'll become a little bit easier.
Yeah, with a little bit of planning and communication, a lot of this can be overcome. Caroline, you've had your first virtual meeting, you've experienced it, and one of the big things that we hear in terms of a fear is with respect to the integrity of the process. So from your experience, what do you see as pros and cons in terms of electronic voting and maintaining the integrity of the process?
So I think the only con really is probably just a perceived one, that the process would somehow be open to fraudulent activity. Depending again on the size of the condominium and what you're willing to spend to hold one of these virtual meetings, there are third-party contractors out there that will host the meeting for you. So basically every owner would get a unique invite, the same as people get to a Zoom webinar. That URL is unique to them. So when they register, the third-party contractor is able to acknowledge that they are the intended party. They are then able to vote securely. During the meeting, you will actually get a email asking you to vote for whatever party, whatever person is your choice for director. You can do the same for any bylaws that need to be passed at that meeting. The meeting that I attended last week, there were 3 bylaws passed and 3 directors that were voted onto the board. So again, I think it just comes down to people's perception of whether there could be some hanky-panky that goes on with the voting process. And I don't think that's any different actually than what some owners think at an in-person AGM. We always have those types of challenges. I think the benefit to having it electronically actually is if the process is challenged, the third-party contractor is able to supply all of the backup, all of the data saying that the emails went where they were supposed to, that the votes came in and were tabulated properly. I think the other concern is at an in-person AGM, generally you're able to appoint scrutineers, owner scrutineers that would oversee the process of tabulating the votes. With the third-party contractor, again, they will be acting as the scrutineer in the background. But again, that can all be verified should anybody have any issue with the way the process was conducted. So all in all, I think it's actually a benefit. I think there is more to verify the process than there would be. Sometimes we get proxies and you can't tell one or the other. A lot of managers will be sitting in their office for an hour or 2 before meetings trying to actually verify a signature against a signature that they may already have on file. So I think this process is actually quite a bit safer.
Thanks, Caroline. And I think the key word there is perceived cons that people are thinking, and it's just the fear of the unknown. And I think as we start to get used to this, I think people will start actually loving it. So thanks, Caroline. So now we're going to move over to Patricia, who is going to take us through the bylaw nuts and bolts and what needs to be in the bylaw, what things don't need to be in the bylaw, sort of giving us an overview of sort of what the guts of the bylaw kind of need to address. So Patricia, I'm going to put up your PowerPoint and then we can get started.
Great. Are you able to run that?
Yeah, I will start it right now.
Perfect, thank you.
There you go.
Perfect. So hello everybody, and this is an exciting time that we're in, and thank you for being with us and taking the time. Sonia, I'm just going to use the raise hand function for me, and when I need you to advance the slide, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So the truth of this and the reality of where we're put into, I think you got to go back.
There you go. Sorry.
No worries. That I think is really the truth of today is improvise, adapt, and overcome. And that's going to be kind of my theme. Although, you know, I want to get to the nuts and bolts, I think it's an important exercise that boards think through in what they want to achieve in these bylaws. So bylaws to create meetings with electronic elements. Now, that I've worded it that way specifically. Sorry, can you go back?
Sorry, Patricia. You know what? Can you just say advanced slide? Because I have to switch between two screens, and so then it's.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just say
okay,
advanced.
Why don't we just do that?
Next.
Advanced.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the perfect slide. Bylaws to create meetings with electronic elements are the features of for condominiums. Why? Well, the pandemic has given us the opportunity to test out some technology with effective success. I would point out that if someone told me 10 years ago I would use a debit card to hold monetary value to purchase products and services, I would have told them they were watching too much sci-fi. But interestingly, we are in the future now. Meetings with electronic elements means we need to consider the future of meetings with both in-person and electronic elements. You know, the in-person meeting is not dead. It is there, and it's definitely a part of many condominiums, and we have to consider it. So our consideration is, how do we design bylaws that address both in-person and electronic elements in terms of managing our meetings? The Condominium Act was amended in 2017 with a view to moving us into the future. I think we need to consider the hybrid meeting and start thinking about our bylaws in this way. Advanced slide, please. So legislative foundation, Sonia gave you an overview of the structure, and I just really want to focus on two elements in the legislation. At this point, 52.1 talks about votes being cast, and specifically telephonic or electronic means is possible if there's a bylaw. So telephonic or electronic means, it's a lovely definition, but it creates complexity when we're starting to design these bylaws. It means that we can use any electronic or telephonic means, but it also talks about telephone calls, emails, automated touch tone systems, computer or computer networks. So when we embrace something broad and when we start to draft bylaws, we have to find the balance and the art in using the breadth of the language of the legislation, but then narrowing it. Bylaws help create that corporate governance structure, and we're trying to achieve a few things: formula, process, and then also meet integrity, transparency, some of the elements that were alluded to by our managers. So accordingly, to undertake a recorded vote telephonically or electronically, the bylaw must be in place. The recent amendments to the regulation under the emergency orders for condominium meetings allows electronic meetings to proceed without a bylaw, but these parameters only apply for the pandemic. I think it's very interesting about these one of the interesting changes here is that the legislative changes that are temporarily in place make it clear that an electronic ballot does not equivocate to a proxy. A proxy allows somebody to attend on your behalf, and that's what gets you admitted to the meeting. An electronic ballot is different because that is for voting for items. So you also have to think about how those two pieces work together when you are drafting your electronic bylaw. You need to appreciate that just because somebody can cast an electronic ballot, that doesn't necessarily meet the standards of the proxy. For those of you who've tried to work through the proxy forms, you know that there are 3 types of proxies that are available. And so you will want to know and be able to, through the technology and thinking ahead, who has which type of proxy and what the scope of the authority is. 56(1)(c) provides for the creation of the bylaw to permit the creation of methods governing the voting of either by a show of hands or the holding of a recorded vote. So again, your bylaw will need to take into account those combined elements of in-person and electronic. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about our bylaws as well, we have to think about the types of meetings and what they're going to be used for. It's not enough to just look at the voting. Typically, AGM, requisition, and bylaw meetings are there. And then there are directors' meetings, which are also permitted by electronic means pursuant to 35(5). And, you know, the one thing to consider, because I think where the complex vote is where you have a proxy that's appointed for limited purposes. Are they there just for quorum? Are they there to vote on procedural matters? Or are they there to vote on anything you give them authority to do, but there may be restrictions because of how they've cast their vote in the actual proxy? So we need to think about that when we're also structuring the bylaw to make sure we've actually addressed every type of meeting and type of vote that can occur. The other complex one that I would bring to your attention and make sure your bylaw is comprehensive is in bylaws, you're allowed to amend them. So in an electronic setting, the question will be, how do you propose an amendment from the floor? How is that going to be dealt with, and how are the votes going to be also measured and tracked? So there's a technical element when you're managing this, the actual physical element of how it gets done through technology, but then making sure that the bylaw addresses these concerns while not over prescribing. And I'm going to repeat that again as we keep going. Next slide, please. So then, in the current pandemic, what can we do? How can we get it passed if we're gearing up for our AGMs and we're looking at service providers? Well, there are a few options. We can call the meeting to approve the bylaws and ask all voting to occur by proxy, so people can still submit the forms, and hold a meeting with socially distancing for up to 10 people, okay? Because that restriction is going to change, I believe, on Friday. But we can also call an electronic meeting to approve the bylaws, and the changes under the legislation for during the pandemic provide us with some flexibility where we don't have the bylaw in place and other elements in terms of allowing electronic service, or doing a combination of both. But there's something else that has to be thought of. The bylaw needs to be approved by the board of directors at a duly constituted meeting, and then the notice needs to be provided. However, in my experience, I think meaningful explanations and communications around the import of the bylaw need to be provided. And it would be wise in these circumstances to allow a dialogue of ideas to occur with unit owners before even sending out the bylaw. Why? Because you want to minimize the amendments that could be proposed on the floor. Where the bylaw is too specific, it will invite specific change. Where the bylaw is too vague, it will also invite challenge for lack of specificity and create distrust. Potentially, no one is ever going to be 100% happy, but you just need 51% to be happy. Or actually, it's a lower threshold. The majority of the people at the meeting have to be happy. Next slide, please. So as we transition to the next part of our discussion on meetings, I'm going to talk a little bit about meeting dynamics, and then I'm going to pass it back to our managers to give us their thoughts. But, you know, some things to consider are, will the bylaw address registration components? And how will you handle amendments from the floor, which I've mentioned? And how complicated will the bylaw have to be? If the board is given power, how much power should they be given to develop protocols and processes? It depends on the level of transparency that you wish to achieve. Thanks, Anya.
Thanks, Patricia. Okay, so that was electronic voting and issues with electronic voting and voting bylaws and pros and cons about electronic voting. So now we're going to switch to electronic meetings or virtual meetings, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to talk to our property managers to get the pros and cons on certain issues that we've been hearing, and then Patricia's going to jump back in and continue her presentation with respect to the nuts and bolts of the bylaw itself. So let's start off with Jeff this time. Jeff, one of the things that we've been hearing is that people are concerned about how you keep control of the meeting, fear of losing the meeting control, and managing all the voices. So Jeff, what are the pros, cons, and any kind of solutions that you may have?
Sure, and it's still a bit of a learning curve as virtual meetings become more normal, but you know, first and foremost is being well prepared. A strong chair that's you know, anticipating what might come from owners attending the meeting and able to keep some order. Having a co-host assigned to the meeting using the Zoom platform, Zoom meeting platform, for example. You can assign a number of co-hosts so that you know, somebody can be working on the sidelines to kind of control the microphones as you've been doing throughout this meeting, so that the chair is not distracted by that that function. So you know, one of the things you can set up in the meeting setup is that everyone's microphone is muted when they join, much as we do with our webinars here on the meeting platform. And then as the chair and potentially other board members provide their reports to the owner, some of the housekeeping items are looked after, like approval of the previous minutes. The screen can be shared for that, and people can review those minutes right on their screen, just as we had Patricia's slideshow a few minutes ago. So, and then having an administrator or the recording secretary, you know, monitoring for questions in the chat box, potentially hands being raised, and motions to approve things. Is if you can avoid the distraction on the chair and let them focus on chairing the meeting, I think it can be a more organized event, and with a host or co-host, you know, controlling the microphone. It's not likely to have somebody just jumping in and interrupting the president's report or the auditor's report or any other reports that might be brought before the owners. Still need to be respectful of the owners. It is their meeting, and they should have opportunity to ask questions, and it's really up to the board to decide if those questions are going to be accepted through the chat box or by raising their hand and making their microphone live. The challenge with the chat box is if somebody's actually calling in because they don't have the technology to use an iPad or some other type of tablet or laptop computer, they're going to be limited to using their voice. They won't be able to use the chat box. So I think the second method is the preferred. You know, raise hand, ask the question. We've done that in our last few webinars on Tuesday evenings for CCI Huronia as well, and it seems to work really well. There is a bit of a lag, but you get used to that. And I think if you share the duties of controlling the meeting and keep the distractions away from the chair to perform their functions, I think it can be done fairly smoothly and fairly to the owners. And you know, part of it's going to be setting the expectations at the beginning of the meeting so everyone knows what to expect. And I think, Sonia, you've done a fantastic job of that ahead of each of our webinars and following that kind of guideline for a virtual homeowner meeting, whether it be an AGM, an SGM, or even a town hall. I think once the expectations are set, the control can stay there. Now, there's, you know, sometimes the occasion, doesn't happen very often. We see the radical owner that just doesn't want to follow the rules of order and so on. I'm sure the other property managers here have never seen any such thing. But the chair does have the ability, if a participant is unruly, to send them to the waiting room, to mute them, or to even remove them from the meeting altogether.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, the nice thing about doing this through Zoom or some other virtual platform is that mute all button, and the chair actually has lots of control in terms of that. So that's a nice feature. I think you got more control in the virtual setting. Okay, Carla,
Absolutely.
one of it's the only time I ever get any power. One of the other things that we hear a lot about in terms of concerns, especially with meetings, and I saw some comments in the chat box about this, is costs. So Carla, give us your perspective in terms of pros, cons, and what your feelings are with respect to costs of being able to do meetings virtually.
Well, I think that besides the access, this is probably going to be one of the bigger challenges. And I don't know that with large condos, this is going to be as much of a challenge, because I'm not sure that the costs, that their budgets will be impacted by that. And they may also have savings by not having to book rooms and things like that. I think that it's the very small condos and the mid-sized condos that are going to find this to be a big challenge. I think if you've got really small condos, like I'm talking, 10, 8, 10, 12 units, you might be able to do it without actually using one of the service platforms and try to do it on your own, so that you're not actually incurring a lot of costs. But I would say it has to be a small number of units, because the reality is that it is still an annual meeting. You still need to be able to register online, run the meeting, and handle voting. And so there has to be some integrity to the meeting. So yes, with very small condos, you might be able to do it with teleconferencing or with Zoom, because everybody knows who all the owners are. But I think that will start to get challenging with more units. So right now, I think there are about 2 platforms that are providing the service. Possibly as more options become available, you might be able to see some changes in the costs, because maybe you might be able to, and there are maybe portions that you don't have to do all of those, all of the items, but business does have to be conducted, and an AGM does need to be held, and this may just become an annual operating cost. I think there's some thoughts to being able to manage the costs. We haven't held one yet, but we are in the process of doing that. I know that there is a significant difference in price with one particular service provider if the meeting is held in the day. And I think you can also watch the costs with the length of the meeting, and maybe we step back and kind of think about that the AGM, there are very specific things that must occur: the audit, the election, the minutes. And maybe the other item is really where owners ask questions. And I think it might be an idea to try and encourage more communication throughout the year, so that people aren't actually waiting until the AGM to bring their list of questions. And if they are able to ask questions throughout the year, then you can limit the time and the time of the meeting. And I think that will help with costs, because if you're running into a 2 or 3 hour meeting, it's going to cost more, as opposed to just get the work done, get the business done. And they basically charge also by the hour. So, but this is definitely a big challenge, and it's a hard sell with smaller condos where they're tight and right now, actually, with the pandemic, I think everybody's a bit uncertain too with additional costs that they might be incurring. So that's really, I think, one of the biggest challenges with this.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, I think it's important that condos look at the tangible and the intangible costs because there is value to time. And so the nice thing about virtual meetings is that you can save time, travel time of not only your professionals, which translates into a tangible cost, but also the owners aren't having to waste their time, which has value to it. So I think condos, when you're looking at it, maybe take a look at both the tangible and intangible costs to see really if it is that much more expensive to go this route. Thanks, Carla. So Caroline, registration. That seems to be something that a lot of people are hung up at in terms of being able to translate the in-person process to a virtual process. So again, you've had this experience because you've just done a virtual meeting. What are your thoughts on pros and cons about virtual meetings when it comes to registration, and any advice you can give people?
Right. So again, I guess the one con is to fully engage in the meeting, to be able to ask questions and to be able to vote. You do need an internet-enabled device, whether that's your computer or your smartphone, an iPad, whatever the case may be. But you can overcome that. You can still, engage in the meeting just by phoning in. You're not going to be able to ask live questions or vote, but you can already have sent in your paper proxy, which will vote for anything that comes up in the meeting. And a lot of managers now, I know we do regularly, when we send out our package, we actually send out a sheet specifically asking for you to send in your questions ahead of time so that managers can be prepared and have the answers ready. So again, anyone that can only call in can already have their questions in, they can already have their voting done. And anyone else, again, if you're using this third-party platform, will get an email inviting them to the meeting. They'll go through the registration process. The third-party contractor will act as the registrar and scrutinize the quorum and give that information to the chair. And they will also, when it comes time to voting, send out another email that will allow you to vote during the meeting itself. So again, I don't think there's really any cons to this other than, again, those perceived cons that you won't be able to engage fully in the meeting. You are able to do that, obviously, not in person and not able to put up your hand, but there are a number of ways. I think Jeff talked to the fact that, there you can raise your hand, you can use the chat function, there's a polling function to get minutes passed or, to ask a question of the auditor or things like that. So it can all be overcome.
Thanks. And again, that perceived and perceptions are key there. Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to the property managers for your insights. So Patricia, back to you. Now we're going to talk about the bylaw for the meetings itself. So I'm going to get your PowerPoint back on.
We can go down to the meetings slide.
There we go.
Thank you. So, we've heard it through the comments brought up by our management panel, that to create a meeting, you need to create trust. That's fundamentally what a bylaw should be supporting. It should support integrity in the meeting, and it creates the framework. And this is also true of the protocols that will go underneath that bylaw. As I said, it's a balance of how much you include in the bylaw, not overly prescribing, but at the same time, not under prescribing. People, will feel comfortable in different circumstances depending on the boundary set in the bylaw. But it's important to remember that meetings still exist. We've done them for ages. We know them. The Act sets a general framework on what needs to be considered, that you will have an AGM. There's no question about that. When you have an AGM, who gets to vote, how and when how and when voting occurs, and what the quorum requirements are. These are already bylaws that are and elements that are in place. There'll also be the consideration of rights of owner-occupied residents, so we need to remember that our framework is still there. We're just drafting within that. Now, when we look at considerations, though, I think, you know, we need to think about proxy holders. They will need to have the right number of ballots. How is that assured? Who is in control of the meetings? Can participants corrupt or disrupt the meeting? How is electronic voting closed before a meeting, and how far in advance is this done of the meeting? How are proxies retracted? How are amendments to the bylaws voted on? How do types of proxies get sorted? Who's going to speak, and what is the order? Are recordings optional or mandatory? Because now with the technology, there is the recording element. Is that a record of the corporation or is it not? Because there still should be a minute taker. Are there candidates going to be nominated from the floor? How are director disclosure forms undertaken? And can unit owners participate by phone if their identity cannot be verified? So the underlying threshold there is, of course, examining in the bylaw whether or not there's a need for the technology to be able to verify the identity of the actual participant. So what will that be in the meeting bylaw potentially? We have to remember that electronic meetings, again, are under the Act, and so the bylaw brings specificity to the same and confirms that a meeting called in accordance with the bylaw meets this requirement. One of the considerations out there in the corporate law world is the fact with AGM for shareholders is also the ability of shareholders to communicate and how that is going to be protected. So we're going to look for bylaws to protect that right. Allowing for hybrid meetings, as I mentioned before, parameters for voting, how it is going to be done, and what the technology must do. This will give a level of comfort to actual unit owners that are approving this bylaw as the standard to which electronic elements of a meeting can be approved. This means, for example, ensuring that if the community believes that you should be able to track through a technical audit trail the voting and how it was done and what the process was done, it also sets direction to the board when they're looking at how to set the thresholds for getting a service provider. So those are also things that can be put into the bylaw. You know, how a unit will be identified is another consideration. What happens when a unit cannot be identified? Who will make that call? How information for consideration at the meeting will be forwarded. Now, this is already part of the changes under in 2017 under the Act and the regulations, but that consideration must be also thought about in this bylaw. One of the critical pieces that I think must be in all of these bylaws, though, is the chair will conduct the meeting in good faith. This is very important. This is already sort of out there. It's case law. You can look at it wherever you look at Nathan's rules or any of those kind of books where we talk about the role of the chair. It is important that the chair know the standard to which it will be expected to perform, but good faith in law has a new meaning now. And so what that means is the chair is still going to be controlling the ability to answer a question or not in these electronic meetings. It's not going to be that somebody can jump up from the floor and say, I want to speak, I want to speak. That's not going to happen in the electronic component of this. And we need to be thoughtful about that. Because I think where the challenge will be on these meetings will be that somebody said, I had my hand up the whole time and the chair never responded. So that is going to be important. And what I'm suggesting as well as part of the protocol underlying these bylaws is that there be more than one host to hold the chair accountable to good faith, but also to act as witness. I've been in enough of these contentious meetings where we've used electronic technology, where we've had to actually take challenges from the floor, address them in the minutes of the meeting to make sure that if it was ever challenged, the integrity of the chair, which happened to be me in those ones, was actually evidenced objectively through actually having answers to the questions on how people could not tamper with votes. Who, in the new meeting, who got to speak and why? When you conduct as a chair, you have to stand back and you're acting in a very particular role. So I think directing the chair is going to be important, but not tying their hands. Again, it's that balance. If you could advance the slide, please, Sonia. So, these are the key elements to the meeting. call to order, proof of notice, affidavit of service, presentation of audited financials, appointment of auditor, election of directors. These are some of the core elements that go into the corporate governance of a good meeting. We all know them well. We've lived through many of them. These are the elements, though, that a bylaw should consider whether or not there is an additional step needed to be taken under the electronic format to ensure the integrity in the eyes of the unit owners. Now, for some things, I think it will be easier as a matter of process. We will still call to order, and we will still have proof of notice. And what is great is that we're going to be able to have a video recording of that element. So certain aspects are not going to be impacted. And I think that's important for us to understand of these platforms. We can overcome not being together, as Caroline said, and I think it's more that attitude of how do you overcome and what is the solution to address the concerns. Advance the slide, please. So again, integrity of the process is critical. I've mentioned exactly, where I think these bylaw elements must show up in terms of managing the meeting as well. What you need to think ahead to and what answers you must have. So I'll leave it there, Sonia.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. All right, well, I want to thank our property managers, Jeff, Caroline, and Carla, and Patricia for joining us. Today, we're going to move now to the live question and answer period. And so, as I said at the beginning, if you have a question that you want to ask, you can raise your hand. And again, you just click on the participant logo and then raise your hand, and that will indicate to me that you want to ask a question. If you're on the phone, you can still do that by pressing *9, and then that will again alert me that you would like to ask a question. If you've put questions in the chat box and they haven't been answered yet, I would encourage you to raise your hand and we'll deal with them live. And I see that we have Vince. He's had his hand raised for a while, so I think he's got a burning question for one of our or some of our speakers. So Vince, I'm going to unmute you. And while I'm trying to unmute you, just please don't try to unmute yourself. Otherwise, we're going to be playing this mute unmute game. So Vince, oh, you were unmuted. Let's try this one more time. All right, Vince, I guess you don't have.
When you ask a participant to unmute, Sonia, they get a little pop-up saying the host has requested you to unmute. And
yeah, that's what I'm doing. But it's Vince, if you're listening, if you could try to unmute yourself. I'm not going to try and unmute you. There you go, Vince.
Okay.
Go ahead,
so
ask your question.
Yeah, okay. I have no questions so far because I got already the answer. I had some technical problem which I sorted out myself. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. We have a question in the chat box about, and this is for Caroline. What size condo did you do the virtual meeting for?
I actually attended as a guest. It was another of our district managers' condos, but I believe it was in and around 290 units. And when we were preparing for this meeting, what I said to the other panelists was, it's interesting to note that even though we're doing these meetings virtually, there seems to be very little difference between the attendance at an in-person meeting versus a virtual meeting. You still seem to have the same number of actual participants. It's not like we're now getting, 2/3 of the condo showing up just because we're doing it virtually.
Okay. Anybody else have a question for any of our speakers? Patricia, we have a question in the chat about a rough idea about the cost of bylaws. Can you give people an idea of what the rough cost would be?
For a one-off bylaw, it's like this, it's usually about $750, but the challenge is also updating. It depends on how old the rest of the bylaws are to make sure they mesh. And, to do the aggregate review in our firm, it's $1,500 for all of the bylaws to be done. So, I think there is, I think people need to see where they are in the updating of their bylaws so that everything can flow correctly through as well.
And Patricia, while we've got you, can you explain what hybrid meetings are? You mentioned a hybrid meeting, and there's some chat in the chat box about hybrid meetings.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, what I've seen from the communities I've served is that there is a real value around an in-person AGM. It brings community together. And it's a great opportunity at least once a year to get out and ask some questions. So what we think is going to happen is, I don't think the in-person meeting will die. I think we will see a combination of in-person and electronic methods being incorporated into a hybrid meeting. And that, I think, is how we will go forward to increase participation and at the end of the day, get the democratic structure working. But I think we will have to think about it. I just don't think we'll be exclusively in one basket or the other. I think condos have to think, combining both elements and how they can work together.
Thanks, Patricia. David, I've unmuted you. You've got a question for one of our speakers?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
When it comes to an electronic meeting, there's a lot of questions about Zoom or platforms like that. But I also heard early on that electronic or telephony means could include email. And I guess I'm just asking, does there have to be that kind of live, it starts at a particular hour, ends at an hour later meeting, or could you have a period of time like a business week where the entire meeting could be done through sending out emails, getting replies? We have a demographic that is highly connected to the internet, but the concept of getting Zoom calls going would just be a mess, or Zoom equivalent meetings. People try to fiddle with their video cameras, fiddle with all the settings. But if we were able to completely do a meeting by starting on a Monday, and you have until Friday at 5 to get any email replies in or email votes in, it seems to me that legally that would still constitute an electronic meeting, because our board has electronic meetings like that, where on a Wednesday afternoon an email comes up and we discuss it for 4 days and we make a decision at the end. It happened over multiple days, but it was a single thread that represented an electronic meeting. That's my question.
Patricia, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think that's a very astute point, and it speaks to the reality of today. I think the challenge is, you have to call a meeting for a specific date, time, place, so people know where to attend. So there has to be integrity around that. What happens in some meetings is that what we will do is, if we can't vote on something, for example, we can extend the time or adjourn the meeting as opposed to terminating the meeting. To keep a meeting open for a week is a very long meeting, and I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable with, leaving it, like, how would you get through the agenda? That would be my concern. I would rather do a motion at the end and extend the time for people to vote on items or to discuss an item and then vote, because that's the thing. Do you need to keep the meeting open, and why? Is there a vote that's pending? But if you're going to use things like email or other, elements like automated touch tone telephone systems, that's where the bylaw will have to be specific. That's where you're going to have to say, for example, if you're familiar with contracts, it says, an email sent at this time on 5 o'clock will be deemed to be received on a business day. Like, that's where we will have to become very specific if we're opening that up, to make sure that there's no questioning as to whether or not the email was, or the fax was sent, or the email was sent in time. So I think it's possible. I think you can do it. It's just that you're going to now have to structure it so it's very clear whether votes count or they don't count.
Thanks. But Deanna, you are unmuted. Do you have a question?
I do, Sonia. We're in a smaller condo, 39 units, with a lot of seniors. Most of them have gotten used to Zoom or Skype or one of the electronic communication tools that they're using for family now. So I'm not anticipating a big problem in going virtual for our AGM. But I'm wondering if anyone has done a demo AGM within their own community that they could send out, just a very short and simple AGM to say, this is what it's going to look like? That's my first question. And the second is, what we're looking at here, we see across the top of the screen the presenters' video, their faces. And I've always found at an AGM as the chairperson, the reaction to people, from people to anything that's going on is very important. Moving forward, how you're discussing certain issues. If you see a look of shock, you're going to respond to that. So has anybody considered using the video part for all of your owners? Obviously, if you have 200 residents in your building, that wouldn't be practical. But for a smaller building, to have all 39 people that you can zoom in on at any time as the chairperson and see what the responses are, and if they are talking, bring their video in as well as their audio.
Does anybody want to tackle that?
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that, Sonia. I think basically when Sonia started the meeting, she asked that you all shut your video down and mute yourselves. So had you not done that, everybody would actually be visible to everyone else. So I think you're absolutely right. In a smaller community, that can absolutely be done. You make a good point, though, when there's 200 units, that then becomes unmanageable. And I think for small communities, small communities where there's trust, you're probably able to conduct an AGM on like a Zoom webinar platform. I think there's a difference with the platforms that Zoom offers. There's Zoom meeting, and then I think there is actually Zoom webinar, which Sonia can say we're on now, I believe, which enables you to do the raise hand function. You can make a motion by raising your hand. Someone can second a motion. You can do polling to elect directors. But again, I think those two things are very important: the size of your meeting and the fact that there has to be complete trust in the process from the participants, because you don't want questions afterwards.
Yeah, we're actually operating on Zoom meeting, not Zoom webinar. And one of the nice things about Zoom meeting, and a big difference between webinar and meeting, is that in the meeting, everybody gets to see everybody. In webinar, only those that are a panelist will be seen. And so if you're going to use webinar, you've got to think that through in terms of whether, and again, some people are using the webinar as a way to do a second registration in terms of registering for a meeting. So there are two platforms in Zoom. And I think, again, as Caroline said, it depends on how big your condo is in terms of number of units and how many people are participating. The other thing is if you're not familiar, in Zoom meeting, there's two different views. There's gallery view and speaker view. So what we are using during these webinars are speaker view. So that means when the person that speaks is talking, they actually pop up in the main screen. And if you do gallery view, you see everybody. And when the person speaks, they're only highlighted, but they don't pop up like you're seeing in the webinar. So you've got to play around with the different formats.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, and maybe to Deanna's point, I believe, who asked the question, you can have the participants muted as they come in and still leave their video active. On the Zoom meeting platform, you can have up to 49 participants on the screen. Even on a 27 or 32-inch screen, though, they would be tiny, so it would be hard to see. 39 owners, chances are you're only going to get about 50% turnout at best, unless there's a special assessment in play or something. So, conceivably you could have 20 images on the screen. I think that's probably manageable, that you'd be able to gauge facial expressions and so on. I'm not so sure on a 12, 13-inch tablet or a laptop screen that you would see that. Zoom does also have the ability to have multiple screens. So in my case, I have speaker view on one screen and participants on another screen, and the chat box on another screen, so that you can see more of what's going on. There's lots of flexibility in that regard. To Caroline's point, the webinar platform does not allow participants to share video. So
Thanks, Jeff. That's a good answer, and I think that cleared up the video part of it. That is one of my concerns, but I think we'll experiment a lot. We're going to try to make some fun out of it for the owners and let them see our vulnerabilities before we get to the actual meeting. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Deanna, is to actually do a test run that's not a formal meeting that needs all the requirements to be fulfilled. Just have a test run on and see how it goes. All right, so we had a question. I don't see any hands up, so if you have a question you want to ask, make sure you get your hand up so that we can address it. But just taking a look at some of the questions in the chat box, and maybe one of the property managers could ask this. People are trying to get an idea of what the costs are with respect to third-party providers. Can any of you give some insight in terms of what the range of costs are?
It can vary. It depends on the size of the corporation. It depends on, if there's going to be votes for various things as well. So, we've seen cost estimates from, I want to say at the lowest, probably about $700 up to close to $2,000. There's a couple different platforms out there and some different pricing structures. Usually it's based on number of units and if they're going to be handling all the administration behind it, sometimes that's worth the while. It's not always the most cost effective for smaller townhouse style units that are very common up here in Huronia, obviously. 39 unit condo that Deanna mentioned earlier, that could be difficult. I think you can manage a smaller corporation, maybe 40 and less is something to consider. And if you have a couple co-hosts, a couple administrators filling that role, you might be able to achieve the same performance of having the AGM and the voting and so on without using a third party. So you might be paying for an extra administrator to attend the meeting for a couple hours. But it becomes comfort level. The board, the chair, the property manager, and what they're able to do. We're doing an AGM on Saturday in that fashion. It's not a condominium; it's a homeowner association. So their only vote's going to be the election of directors, and we're going to try it out without a third party because. They pay an annual fee, which is very minimal for access to a pool and a number of other things. So the cost of hiring a third party for 170 participants, they just found it wasn't cost effective. They probably have to special assess to do it. So,
Carla, what are you seeing in terms of costs? Oh, we might have lost Carla. Caroline, what are you seeing?
Again, just depending on the size of the condominium. I mean, Jeff's right. We've seen them probably closer to 3,000, but again, that would include sending out the packages, and some of these second party or third party providers also provide minute taking services themselves, as opposed to having to bring in another minute taker. So I think the highest I've seen is in around 3,000.
Okay, thanks. Carla, are you there?
Yeah, yes, same thing as what Jeff has experienced, like 800 to, I think for about 80 units, we were looking at about $1,200. But there are different, there are different options. You can choose for just registration, or you can choose just for voting. There are a few different options. But for a smaller condo, that becomes significant. And I think maybe with the use of, with some of our very small ones, they're making use of proxies and also either Zoom or Teams or one of the web-based meetings platforms, and it's working not bad, I think, but again, small numbers.
Okay, thanks, Carla. Patricia, there was a question in the chat that I think you might have answered, but for the benefit of people who can't see the chat, the question was, at electronic board meetings, an email vote is a vote. Does that not apply in other types of electronic meetings?
Yes, it can apply if it's specified in a bylaw. Because if you look at 52, 1 and the definition of electronic or telephonic means, it actually uses the term email. But it has to be specified in the bylaw, so people have to make that step, and it doesn't specify which type of meeting. So it is possible, but it has to be put in place properly.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is the last call for live questions. I don't have any hands raised. If someone wants to take this opportunity, while we have some great knowledgeable people available to answer your questions, I'm going to give everybody 10 more seconds to raise their hand. And if I don't see any, then I think that is going to be the end of our question and answer period. All right, well, it doesn't look like we're having anybody raise their hand, so I think we'll end the question and answer period there. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and their time. I also like to thank once again our generous sponsors, Alita Associates Professional Corporation, Condo Genie, and CWB Maxim Financial. Thank you again for supporting us and for allowing us to hold this webinar for free. There are some upcoming events, and I know that Debbie has put them in the chat box during the webinar, but in case you've missed it, some of our local chapters in Ontario are hosting events. So CCI Toronto on June 19th is doing a webinar, a lunch webinar on dollars and cents, condo budgeting. You can register on their website, ccitoronto.org. Golden Horseshoe is doing a webinar on June 23rd called Cash Flow, How to Not Go Bankrupt. You can register on their website, cci-ghc.ca. Grand River Chapter is doing their Leaders Circle on July 7th. You can register at cci-grc.ca. And don't forget, CCI Huronia will be doing their next COVID webinar on June 23rd at 7 p.m. And so you can register on our website, ccihuronia.com, in the coming week. If you're interested in any of our webinars, you can always go to the CCI Huronia website and look at past webinars. They're posted there. And I just want to, once again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to our sponsors. And until next time, I'm Sonia Hodis on behalf of CCI Huronia. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us today. Hope we'll see you at one of our next Lunch and Learn webinars. Stay tuned. We will have a series coming in the fall, starting in September. And until then, stay safe, enjoy your summer, and don't forget that CCI is your condo connection. Have a great day, everyone.